Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Friedrich Nietzsche's book, The Dawn of Day, also known as Daybreak. I previously read and talked about Human All Too Human, which was a transitional work. This book here, okay, along with Daybreak, and then the Joyful Science, kind of form like an unofficial trilogy of books. So this is like the middle. These three books here comprise what's known as Nietzsche's middle period. So if you have not read or watched the review for Human All Too Human, you may want to go back and watch that, because this book here, Dawn of Day, is going to be touching on a lot of the topics that were already discussed in that video, and then kind of expanding on them or pushing them forward. So I'm going to get into the subtitle of this book. This book, Dawn of Day, was written and published in 1881. It's a philosophical text. As you can see, the subtitle here is Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality. So Nietzsche got into, in this book, there was 9 books in this, and he introduced the use of the aphorism. And he's going to continue here. This is divided into 5 books, and it's also, he makes use of the aphorism, which is kind of a technique, I guess, he developed from the French philosophers, or it comes from like the French philosophical tradition. So, get a little bit into what this book is about. As you can see from the title here, the subtitle, we're going to be dealing with morality, and specifically the foundations of morality. Now, I took some notes on this, so I'll be reading off of these. But essentially, the title here, The Dawn of Day, is what Nietzsche is conceiving of as like a new day, as in a new system, that the old way of doing things he wants to do away with, and then this is the dawn of the new way of dealing with things. And he's going to expand upon what he talked kind of about in books 2 and 3 of Human All Too Human. He's going to expand on that topic, which is morals. And for Nietzsche, morality is nothing more than a shared custom or a tradition. And he's going to let's see, I'll read for you here what he has to say about it. This is from aphorism number 9. This is in book 1. He says, morality is nothing else, and above all, nothing more than obedience to customs of whatsoever nature they may be. And then he says about tradition down here, he says, what is tradition? A higher authority which is obeyed, not because it commands what is useful to us, but merely because it commands. So he's going to, that's his conception of what morals actually are. That they're any sense of them coming from like a source of divinity or divine command, he's already undermined in Human All Too Human, and he's going to continue with that here. Now, talking about morality. So we've talked about what his definition is. It's a shared custom or a tradition. The usefulness of a shared custom or a tradition is that it binds a society together. If you have a shared custom and tradition, for instance, if you're like in a tribe or something, it is something that holds that community and bonds them. Now, Nietzsche is going to say that the problem with the moral system that we have in place is that it's based on metaphysics. And so he's already talked about undermining metaphysics in Human All Too Human, and he's going to repeat many of those same themes here. He has a critique of Plato. Okay, but before I get to that, I want to talk some more about the morals. I have a couple of things outlined here. So aphorism 103, we'll see what it is that I pegged that I thought was important. And then we'll talk about that. And then we'll get into aphorism, I think 108. So let's see, 103. Pause this for a second. Okay, so in aphorism 103 here, Nietzsche says, I deny morality in the same way as I deny alchemy. I deny its hypothesis, but I do not deny that there have been alchemists who believed in these hypotheses and based their actions upon them. I also deny immorality. Not that innumerable people feel immoral, but that there is any true reason why they should feel so. I should not, of course, deny, unless I were a fool, that many actions which are called immoral should be avoided and resisted, in the same way that many which are called moral should be performed and encouraged. But I hold in both cases that these actions should be performed from motives other than those which have prevailed up to the present time. So, again, what he's saying is that he doesn't believe in morals as they currently stand. It's not that he doesn't believe in morality, it's the foundations that morality is built upon is what he's attacking, and that's specifically the metaphysical reality of it. He goes on into aphorism 108, I have marked here. The precepts, which are called moral, are in reality directed against individuals and do not by any means make for the happiness of such individuals. So really the problem that Nietzsche is seeing with morality as it currently stands is that if it's a shared custom and a tradition, the fundamental basis of it, that is to act in accordance with the community for the good of the community, is considered moral, and to basically be an individual and go against the tradition is then considered evil. So anything that's done for the betterment of the community is good. Anything that's done as an individual is bad. That's an oversimplification, but that's really the gist of it, is that his problem with it is that it quashes the ego and it stifles passion. And that's really one of his main issues. He goes on to highlight the problem with morality as he sees it in aphorism 425 here. He says in aphorism 425, men have become suffering creatures in consequence of their morals, and the sum total of what they have obtained by these morals is simply the feeling that they are far too good and great for this world, and that they are enjoying merely a transitory experience on it. As yet the proud sufferer is the highest type of mankind. So this really highlights kind of like his issue is that it's Platonism. He wants to get rid of metaphysics. Now metaphysics, already talked about this before. If you, for instance, think of Plato's allegory of the cave, because he attacks Plato in this work. In aphorism 448, he says of Plato that, Plato fled from actuality and wished to contemplate things only in their pale mental concepts. He was full of sensitiveness and knew how easily the waves of this sensitiveness would drown his reason. So, must the sage therefore say, I will honor reality, but I will at the same time turn my back to it because I know and dread it? Ought he to behave as certain African tribes do in the presence of their sovereign, whom they approach backwards, thus showing their reverence at the same time as their dread? So he's saying that what Plato's worldview, the realm of the forms, leads to is a contradiction, in that you cannot honor both the metaphysical realm and the physical realm at the same time. That actually what happens, and this is this is kind of like where his attack is coming at as far as morality is concerned, or morals, is he thinks that everything went south with Plato, like Platonic thought, right? Um, because it grounds everything into this other realm. In other words, the realm of the forms. So if you have not seen the video on Plato's allegory of the cave, there's one that's narrated by Orson Welles that I think is quite good. I did put it in the community tab, but I'll link it below in the description box. I think it would be helpful to watch that so you can see specifically what it is that, you know, Nietzsche's attacking here. And it's this idea that there's a higher realm than the physical realm, the material world that we live in. This idea that there is underneath, you know, for instance, I don't know, like this pumpkin here, right? Like there's an undergirding essence of pumpkin that's rooted and grounded in some other invisible realm that we can't see. Okay? That's what he's attacking. And that's like the higher reality. That's the real. So if you've ever seen The Matrix, right? Like they're all plugged into the Matrix, and then Neo takes the red pill and wakes up, and Morpheus says to him, "Welcome to the real world." He's been living inside of a simulation the whole time. It's like the world that he was living in wasn't the real world, and then being unplugged, he wakes up and he sees the real world as it is. And that's kind of like what Nietzsche is saying as far as Plato's concerned. And this is also his critique of Kant, Immanuel Kant, his critique of Schopenhauer, his critique of Christianity, as he says that they all make this other world, this world of the forms, or in the case of Christians, you know, heaven, you know, God, that's the most important thing. And then the physical world that we live in kind of becomes secondary, or even worse, in the case of it's not that it's not even important, or that it's actually evil, that the material realm is actually seen as bad. And you know, this is kind of a oversimplification. I think Nietzsche is that's kind of more of a Gnostic way of viewing things, although I would say that some forms of Protestantism have really trended towards Gnosticism. You know, this whole idea of dualism, that the physical world is bad and evil, and that all that matters is the spirit. That's not Orthodox Christianity doesn't teach that. There is dignity in all of creation. After all, God said in the book of Genesis, after he looked upon all the things that he had created, he said it's good, right? The creation's good. So Nietzsche wants to get rid of metaphysics. He thinks that Plato's the problem, the whole Socratic tradition. And he's actually more of a fan of the pre-Socratics. Specifically, I think Heraclitus. Now, the pre-Socratic teachers, they were grounded in the realm of empiricism. So, empiricism, in case you don't know what that term means, it's sense data, things that we can sense and touch, you know, experience through our five senses, through our taste, our touch, our sight, our smell, and our hearing. Okay, things that can be measured, things that we can see. So for Nietzsche, he wants to ground everything in the material realm rather than in a metaphysical realm, i.e., that morals come down to us through divine command or through some sort of reasoning back to the good. In other words, anything that's grounded in a higher plane of reality, that for Nietzsche may or may not actually exist, and therefore, since we can't prove that it exists in his estimation, it's useless to us, and we ought to just abandon it and just base everything on the material realm. Now, the reason why he likes Heraclitus is because for the pre-Socratics, they were looking for this undergirding principle in reality, okay? And for Heraclitus, he conceived that it was fire, that everything in the universe was made of fire. Now, that's kind of primitive, but you could see like how that progresses and other people would come up with this idea of the atom. And everything today, we know the atoms and molecules make up everything. It's grounded in materialism, okay? It's not coming from somewhere else. It's grounded in the material world, other than to some other plane of existence. And so Nietzsche really wants to base everything on, at least in this work, now I don't know what he's going to say later, but on materialism. Okay? And some things come from this that are consequences of adopting a materialistic worldview. Number one, the creation that we live in, the world, well, he wouldn't say it's created, whatever. Christianity teaches that the world is created. That for the Christian, the foundational undergirding principle isn't the atom, it's God. That the arche, the first principle or the fount of everything is God the Father. For him, it's material. It's material realm. I don't know, the Big Bang. I suppose he's buying into evolution, whereas in the first book he criticized it. The first book reviews, he criticized Darwin's theories, but he seems to be adopting the Darwinist worldview as far as evolution is concerned, with equating man to some sort of an ape. However, I think he's rejecting some of the conclusions that Darwin draws. For instance, let me read here. So he says here in aphorism 108, he says that evolution does not make happiness its goal. It aims merely at evolution and nothing else. It is only if humanity had a universally recognized goal that we could propose to do this or that. For the time being, there is no such goal. So he does believe in evolution, but he sees problems in it, and that there's, evolution is just evolution. And for Darwin, it's survival of the fittest. So he believes in, like, for instance, the evolution of man. But this whole idea of the survival of the fittest, he rejects. So, yeah, that's where he differs with Darwin. So I think I was wrong on this when I said he was totally, rejecting Darwin's theories. That was incorrect. So when we're talking about the denial of divinity, and you don't have things grounded in the metaphysical realm, and everything is grounded with your first principles, okay, that you're starting with the materialism, you're going to get some consequences from that. One of these is that since the material world that we live in, the creation that we live in, is always subject to change. All right, you look around at the world, for instance, and you see the changing of the seasons. The wind blows and you see leaves blowing all off, and, things erode with time. For instance, like the Grand Canyon and whatnot is from where? From the waters flowing through. Everything's always in a constant state of flux. You look at material such as water. It changes through states of liquid, gas, and solids. So there is nothing permanent in materialism. Material is always changing. The material world we live in is always in a state of flux. And therefore, if your first principles are grounded in a material world, then it follows that there is no absolute truth, because truth isn't grounded then, therefore, in some transcendent principle that's not in a state of static, unchanging, right? Like some ethereal realm where things aren't subject to change, i.e. God or the divine. If your principles are grounded in metaphysics, or not grounded in metaphysics, but in materiality, they are subject to change constantly. So that's why Nietzsche can say that there is no absolute truth. And I did write this down, but I don't know He does repeat that in this book, but I can't remember where it is. So I'm just going to skip past that. The point is that there's another, no moral absolutes. Let's see here. So this is from Aphorism 139, where he says, there are no absolute morals. There are no absolute morals. He says, for instance, in Human All Too Human, there is no absolute truth. So it's the same thing. The other thing you're going to get is this denial of free will. So the will of man, right, that mankind has no free will. He says this in Aphorism 128, so we'll go there. So he says here that the doctrine of free will has as its parents man's pride and sense of power. He denies the free will. He denies that man has a free will. He denies, or rather, he can't understand reason, human consciousness. Aphorism 123, reason. How did reason come into the world? As is only proper, in an irrational manner by accident. We shall have to guess at this accident as a riddle. So there's things that when you throw metaphysics out the window, you can't explain. One of these is human consciousness. There's no explanation for it. Since it's grounded in the material realm, who knows what reasoning is or what will is? I mean, you really don't have a will. So these are results of adopting a materialistic foundation. If your foundational principle is materialism, you don't have explanations for these things. Okay? And of course, you could say, scientists could say, well, it's just chemicals and Neuraps is firing or whatever. But it's really not a sufficient explanation because it doesn't tell you what it is. All right? Now, we're going to get into talking about what he says. Since he doesn't believe in free will, there is this whole idea of opposing forces that he brings up in Aphorisms, I think it's 109 here. And that is a really interesting thing that we will discuss because he talks about the let's see, the will to combat the violence of a craving is beyond our power. So there again, you see the denial of free will. But he says that this self-control and moderation, like he goes through basically 6 ways of dealing with a drive or an impulse. So for instance, we'll just go through these real quick. I find not more than 6 essentially different methods for combating the vehemence of an impulse. So for instance, say I get a sudden craving to drink alcohol, right? We'll say, how are you gonna combat this impulse? First, we may avoid the occasion for satisfying the impulse, weakening and mortifying it by refraining from satisfying it for a long and ever lengthening period. So, how do? You avoid it. So I don't have alcohol available. I don't go to a bar. I don't go to a liquor store. I avoid places where that impulse would rise up in me. And then maybe through a prolonged lack of having it, perhaps the impulse will weaken. Secondly, we may impose a severe and regular order upon ourselves in regard to the satisfying of our appetites. By thus regulating the impulse and limiting its ebb and flow to fixed periods, we may obtain intervals in which it ceases to disturb us. By beginning in this way, we may perhaps be able to pass on to the first method. So that's the second way. In third place, we may deliberately give ourselves over to an unrestrained and unbounded gratification of the impulse in order that we may become disgusted with it. So this is the idea of, like, if you catch your kid smoking a cigarette, you make them smoke the whole pack and it makes them sick. So then they don't want to smoke anymore. That's what he's talking about there. Then the fourth way is an intellectual trick, which consists in associating the idea of gratification so firmly with some painful thought that after a little practice, the thought of gratification itself is immediately felt as a very painful one. And he gives the example of Christians when they think of or they equate a moral transgression to sin. The consequences of sin for a Christian are eternal separation from God, demons, devils, hellfire, that bringing these negative images and connecting them with sin, connecting them with this impulse will keep them from doing it. It doesn't necessarily have to be, Christianity. This is just merely an example. I guess if any way you could connect a negative impulse with a passion, for instance, if like every time you, if every time you smoked a cigarette, like somebody shocked you with an electrical current, right? It's basically conditioning yourself to have a negative response to this craving. So number 5, he says, in the 5th place, we may bring about a dislocation of our powers by imposing upon ourselves a particularly difficult and fatiguing task, or by deliberately submitting to some new charm and pleasure in order to turn our thoughts and physical powers into other channels. So you either replace the impulse or you go do vigorous activity. So for instance, you want to do something, you want to get drunk, right? I want to get drunk. So instead of doing that, I go, I'm going to go do something else instead. I'm going to go work out. Or instead of drinking alcohol, you're going to do something else. Play video games, whatever, something to get your mind off of it. Go do some vigorous activity. In other words, you just replace it with a stronger impulse. So for Nietzsche, there really is no way to combat the natural impulses that we have, the passions that are in us. As he says here, the will to combat the violence of a craving is beyond our power. While we thus imagine that we are complaining of the violence of an impulse, it is at its bottom merely one impulse, which is competing with another. So you have these impulses within you that are in competition, and there's really nothing you can do about it. The only way to defeat one impulse is to replace it with another. So if I want to drink, then maybe I pray instead, something like that. So that's what he's getting at. Now, there's a lot of things in here that I agree with, but I think Nietzsche goes a little bit overboard in this book. This is really polemic as far as compared to this one. I mean, he did attack Christianity in this, but in this one he goes really off. I intended to do this as part of a 5-book series where I was going to go through each book and talk about them individually. I decided not to do that. I did record the first one, and what ended up happening was, because he was on such a tirade going off on Christianity, he made some really bold claims. That almost ended up being an apologetic for Christianity on the things that he said about the Apostle Paul, the things that he accused Christians of, about stealing the scriptures from the Jews and twisting it for their own. So I made that video private. I will link that in the description box. If you want to watch that video, you can only see it through the link there. So that's only if you're interested in it. It's very much more of a Christian apologetic, because, I could talk about this book you could probably do 40 hours of material out of this, and I'm just not really interested in doing that. I don't think that it would be interesting for you as an audience, and I probably would get bored with it. So it's a lot of things that he's touching on in here. For instance, he's already touched on in Human All Too Human. He's going to make critiques against socialism, capitalism, nationalism, basically any social structure that he sees as quashing the ego. For him, anything that suppresses individuality, the passion, he thinks is bad. So he wants to attack that and destroy it. The only problem is that I find with Nietzsche in here is that after he takes the wrecking ball to everything, he really doesn't have any solution for what to do next. He kind of treats it and says so like it's some sort of grand experiment that we're all basically just like anybody that's a quote unquote free spirit, somebody that bucks tradition and morality, that this is some sort of an experiment and that maybe someday science will give us the answers for it. So I'm thinking that maybe he'll get into providing some sort of solution for what he's created here with destroying in the joyful science, right? Like maybe he'll start like trying to construct something, but so far he's just been tearing down. So I guess that's going to conclude this. I'm going to leave it here. I find Nietzsche an interesting individual. I don't know what to say about it. Clearly his worldview and mine don't align, but I do like to see where other people's worldviews are coming from and what they're grounding in. And I think that this is really important because I think the foundation of, the 20th and maybe the 21st century that we're in still kind of has these Nietzschean principles at work in them, relativism, the denial of absolute truth, all these competing value systems, the undermining of metaphysics. It's all there. It's all present. So these things haven't gone away. They're still here. So, yeah, I hope this didn't bore you to death or whatever, but that's kind of just my summary and takeaway of Nietzsche thus far. Still haven't seen anything about will to power. I know that's his big thing, so I'm kind of wondering when that pops up. I think it might pop up here in the Joyful Science, but I know it'll pop up for sure in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Haven't got there yet. So this will be next. As always, if you want to see that Christian apologetic I did on Nietzsche's attacks on the Apostle Paul and on Christianity, you can click the hidden link in the description box below. Other than that, that's going to conclude this discussion. Thanks for watching, and have a wonderful day.